Hello, this is Dr. Packer. Today we are going to review in this lesson some of the material that was covered in your readings and videos for Day 5 primarily. We will focus on 3 questions. What were the prevailing views about species mutability during Darwin's time? And mutability simply refers to how species change, whether or not they change. What was revolutionary about Darwin's mechanism of evolution? And how natural selection causes evolution. During the 17th century, people primarily thought that the church doctrine of special creation explained the creation of species. So what the church doctrine of special creation says is that all creatures have been created independently of one another by God and are organized into a hierarchy, which we refer to as a chain of being, with man occupying the highest position in that hierarchy. So you can imagine a ladder with humans at the top. They also believed that there was a 6,000-year-old limit on the age of the planet, so they believed in young Earth creationism. Part of this, the timing regarding the age of the Earth was due to work by James Ussher, who was a 17th century Anglican bishop in Northern Ireland. And what he did was, using the Bible, he counted the generations of individuals and added them to modern history to set a date of creation at approximately October 23rd, precisely October 23rd, 4004 BC, making the Earth approximately 6,000 years old. Aristotle, who most of us are familiar with as a prominent Greek philosopher, had very strong influences on early Western science. Actually, science emerged from the tradition of philosophy called natural philosophers, who asked questions about why the natural world was the way it was. So Aristotle said that God created a continuous series of life forms, a scale of nature, so to speak, from the simplest to the most complex, with humans at the top, only superseded by the Creator, which embodies perfection. And what Aristotle believed was that all organisms, including humans, were created in their present form and have remained relatively unchanged since the point at which they were created. So species, according to Aristotle and Ussher and others during this time, were what we would call immutable or unchanging. There were, however, other perspectives that existed. So even during the 1700s, in 1800s, there were some individuals who were proposing that maybe species weren't immutable, maybe the age of the Earth was older than 6,000 years, and during that long period of time that the Earth has existed, species had had time to change. However, they did not really have a mechanism by which they changed. So Erasmus Darwin was Charles Darwin's grandfather, actually, and he was a popular poet and a natural philosopher at the time. And remember, natural philosophers are what we think of today as scientists, although not necessarily using the formal methods of science today. He was considered radical in several ways. So he opposed slavery, he really supported women's right to education, and perhaps most radical was that he proposed an early theory of evolution. He suggested that the life on Earth and the Earth itself must have been evolving, in his words, for millions of ages before the commencement of the history of mankind. So the Earth exists before humans are present on it, as well as life on Earth exists before humans, and therefore is very old. He wrote in one of his books, The Temple of Nature, "Organic life beneath the shoreless waves was born and nursed in ocean's pearly caves. First forms, minute, unseen by spheric glass, meaning microscopes, move on the mud or pierce the watery mass. These, as successive generations bloom, new powers acquire and larger limbs assume." So over time, over multiple generations, he's saying that the traits of organisms change, whence countless groups of vegetation spring and breathing realms of fin and feet and wing. So another thing that he mentions, which we won't talk about much in this class, is that he proposes that the first life began in the water, which is actually what many people believe today. So Erasmus Darwin didn't propose a mechanism per se, but he proposed that the earth was very old and that over time life evolved, first beginning in water and then moving onto land and changing over millions of years. George Louis Leclerc was a French naturalist, and he also put forth ideas about evolution. He thought, incorrectly, largely, that the environment acted directly on organisms through this mysterious force that he called organic particles. So organic particles are components of the environment that influence the traits of living organisms. He also speculated that the Earth must be at least 75,000 years old. I don't know exactly how he came up with that number, but the important thing here is that he's saying it's definitely older than the 6,000 years that has emerged from Ussher's calculations based on the Bible. And he also suggested that humans and apes share a common ancestor, which was very revolutionary at the time. In line with what we've learned about what science is, he proposed and insisted, in fact, that natural phenomena, so things that we observe in the natural world, must be explained by natural laws rather than theological doctrine. So supernatural explanations that cannot be tested are not acceptable explanations for natural phenomena. We're going to focus probably most in depth on, in addition to Darwin, on Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. He was also a French naturalist, and he put forth an evolutionary theory as well. He was the first to really propose a testable mechanism. So others had proposed mechanisms, but mechanisms that could not be tested. And Lamarck proposed a mechanism that could in fact be tested. So this is a bit of his original writing. He wrote that time and favorable conditions are the two principal means which nature has employed in giving existence to all of her productions. So through time and favorable conditions, nature has given existence to her productions, the organisms that we see, and we know that for her time has no limit. In other words, the earth is very old, and that consequently, she always has it at her disposal. So Lamarck's mechanism was based on use and disuse. So organisms acquired characteristics based on use of the relevant traits, and if they didn't use particular traits, they would tend to disappear. This is not true, but this is what he said. And I'll give an example in a minute. So when those traits are acquired or lost during the lifetime of an individual, Lamarck said that the change in the parent would be then inherited by the offspring, and we refer to this as the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So according to Lamarck's mechanism, if we imagine a population of giraffes, there's an original short-necked giraffe ancestor over here, but the leaves that it eats are higher up, so it needs to stretch its neck in order to reach those higher up leaves. And in the process of stretching its neck, which is driven by inner need, this is a really important point, so the development of the trait is driven by inner need. That giraffe needs to reach those leaves, and therefore its neck changes so that it can reach those leaves. The neck becomes progressively longer. Okay, so again, this is not how it really works, I want to stress, but this is what Lamarck proposed, and it's testable. Okay, so when the neck becomes stronger within that individual, Lamarck would say that that individual with a longer neck would then give birth to longer-necked offspring. So the inheritance of acquired traits. Okay. So let me just go back for 1 second. Lamarck's idea was tested very easily in a classic experiment that's often referenced, where they simply took mice. This is going to sound a bit cruel, but they took mice and cut off the tails. So that's a change in the trait in the lifetime of the mouse. And if Lamarck's ideas are right, you would expect that that trait would then be passed on to offspring. And again, clearly when the mouse had offspring, or mice, they were not tailless. So that, along with other simple experiments, could disprove Lamarck's ideas. So let's look now at how Darwin's ideas differed from those of Lamarck. So Darwin lived in the 1800s. He is most famous for his trip on the Beagle, known as the Voyage of the Beagle. And he also authored a famous book called The Origin of Species by Natural Selection, and that was published in 1859. What Darwin did in that book that was so unique and monumental was two things. First, he presented a vast body of evidence that all living creatures are descended from ancestral species. So this is the idea of descent with modification. Over time, from a single ancestor, species have evolved, diversified, and now exist in the multiple forms we see today. And this is from his journal that he kept during his travels. So this is his image of what that would look like. What would a tree look like that showed descent with modification? And so here we see in number 1, that would be the ancestral species from which all other species descended. And we would see the trajectory of descent here, where each line on the tip of these branches showed a new species, and the line up to that tip showed the pathway that they had taken during the period in which they were diverging from the common ancestor. Which is actually this tree is very similar to trees that we see produced by scientists today based on really sophisticated molecular technologies. The next thing he did that was equally important was that he proposed that natural selection was the mechanism by which this evolution took place. So the process of natural selection drives the creation of new species. We're going to look at what natural selection is next. So how does natural selection work? This comes from a website in the bottom corner here, evolution.berkeley.edu, Evo Library. They have wonderful resources on evolution if you want to read more at that website. And this is the same site that you were reading about the nature of science during day 1. So first, natural selection is really simple. First, there's variation in traits. So not all individuals look alike. We see this clearly when we look around at humans. We don't all look alike. So if we look at the scenario from the Berkeley website, in this case we're looking at beetles. Some are green, some are brown. There's variation in beetle color. Next, there needs to be differential reproduction for evolution to take place. So all differential reproduction means is that some individuals leave more offspring than others. Since the environment can't support unlimited population growth, not all individuals get to reproduce to their full potential. So perhaps the brown individuals leave more offspring because the green are preferentially attacked by birds who are preying on them. Perhaps there's just simply not enough food in the environment or habitat in the environment for all beetles, and individuals that have a particular trait are able to succeed better than individuals with a different trait. So in this picture, we're seeing birds acting as the selective force. And what I mean by selective force is that they are essentially, through their predation, deciding who lives and dies, and therefore which individuals reproduce and leave offspring that enter the next generation. So that's differential reproduction. Not all individuals leave the same offspring, and how many offspring they're able to leave is dependent on the trait. Next, there needs to be heredity. So that trait needs to be, at least to some extent, heritable. That means it can't be solely due to some component of the environment. For instance, maybe the brown beetles could be green beetles if they were eating a different diet. If the trait is based on diet, for example, it would not be heritable, and therefore we wouldn't expect to see natural selection working. So the trait needs to be heritable. What this means is that the surviving brown baby beetles will have brown baby beetles, right? At least they're more likely to have brown baby beetles. That is a tongue twister. And that's because this trait has a genetic basis, right? The DNA of the organisms, the genetic code, provides the information that influences the trait itself, like beetle color. The end result of the above 3 steps is evolution. Okay? So over time, those individuals with the more advantageous trait, in this case brown coloration, will have more offspring, and they will become more common in the population. Therefore, the brown trait will become more common in the population. Possibly, if this continues for long periods of time, we might see a beetle population where green individuals are completely removed from the population. So we say that there has been evolution from the initial population, which was 50% brown beetles, 50% green beetles, to the final population, which is all brown. Okay? One of the common misconceptions about evolution is that individual organisms evolve. That is not the case. So these green individuals never change to brown individuals. Evolution takes place at the level of the population or the species. So what that means is that we've seen this population evolve. We've seen the evolution of brown beetle color through the steps of natural selection, so that the proportion of individuals in some later generation has changed from the proportion of individuals that were brown in the initial population. The individuals themselves are born one particular color in the case of beetles, and they remain that color throughout their lifetime. So let's look at the giraffes that we looked at for Lamarck, but now let's consider how they would evolve according to Darwin's ideas about natural selection. So we see that initially we have an original group of giraffes, and there's variation in some trait. Traits are also referred to as phenotypes. So there's variation in the phenotype. Some individuals have longer necks than others. Natural selection favors longer necks in this scenario. That means that individuals with longer necks have a higher fitness. They're more likely to leave offspring to go on to reproduce in the next generation. And as a result, after many generations, the group is still variable, so we don't remove all variation in the group, but on average, the neck length of the group is longer. So let's look at this again using the same vocabulary that we did in the previous slide. So in this first picture, we see that there's variation in traits, and that variation in traits is heritable. So these longer-necked individuals are more likely to have longer-necked offspring. There's differential reproduction. So individuals with traits that are best suited to the local environment will, on average, have the greatest fitness. Again, fitness means they leave more offspring that are able to survive and reproduce themselves. Okay, well, why do I have local environment highlighted here and on average highlighted? Natural selection doesn't say that there is a trait that is best overall. It says that there's a trait that allows individuals who have that trait to do better in a particular environment. So in an environment where the leaves on trees are higher up in the canopy, long necks would be an advantage, right? That's the local environment. But you can imagine that in another environment where the vegetation is in the shrub layer, that long necks might actually be a disadvantage. They might actually make those individuals who possess those longer necks more susceptible to predation when they're bending down to feed. Okay, so when you're considering differential reproduction, what we're talking about is that individuals with traits best suited to the local environment, on average, have the greatest fitness. On average is in there because it doesn't mean that an individual with a short neck in this environment where there's tall vegetation might not survive to reproduce. It just means that, on average, individuals with longer necks are going to have greater success. And the end result is evolution. So the traits of those individuals that were more successful will be disproportionately represented in the next generation. There'll be more individuals with that beneficial trait in the next generation relative to the starting generation. And that's what we talk about when we're talking about microevolution. Macroevolution we'll talk about later in the class. Macroevolution refers to the creation of biological diversity, so species formation, the pattern that results from millions of years of microevolution. Right now we're focusing on microevolution, which we refer to as changes in gene frequencies from one generation to the next. So changes in neck length, Since neck length is heritable, presumably there's some underlying genetic basis, and therefore we're not just seeing changes in the phenotype from generation to generation, we're seeing changes in the underlying genotype that's leading to that phenotype. When we're talking about adaptation, we're specifically talking about traits that have evolved through natural selection because that trait confers an advantage to individuals in the population who possess that trait. So in the two examples we've just talked about, we would say that brown coloration in the beetles is an adaptation, and long neck length in the giraffes is an adaptation. We can't assume that any trait that we see an organism possess is necessarily an adaptation, although people are often tempted to tell just what we call just so stories and kind of presume that they know how that trait evolved. In order to really know that a trait is an adaptation, we need to show that individuals who possess that trait have a higher fitness than individuals without that trait. Even then, it could be what we call a pre-adaptation, but minimally you need to show that individuals with that trait have a higher fitness than individuals with other forms of the trait. So let's look at evolution driven by natural selection in the lens through which we considered science itself. Right? So does evolution offer testable hypotheses? In other words, is evolution scientific? So does it focus on the natural world? Yes. Does it aim to explain the natural world? Well, yes, it aims to explain how species change over time. We'll skip the next one and go on to the second to last. So does it rely on evidence? You can certainly do experiments on evolution and collect evidence to support the idea of evolution by natural selection. And does it involve the scientific community? Absolutely. There are many peer-reviewed journals that focus on evolutionary biology, evolutionary ecology, and evolutionary genetics, all sorts of aspects of evolution. So let's go back to the idea of testable hypotheses now, testable ideas. So one way of looking at this, or flipping this question is, could you potentially disprove evolution? Could you say that evolution didn't occur? Or must we, by definition, accept evolution? So is it a non-science? Is it outside the realm of science? So how could we disprove evolution? Well, we could show that there's no variation in a trait among individuals within the population, right? So all individuals are identical with respect to the trait we're talking about. All individuals have brown coloration in the beetles. All individual giraffes have exactly the same neck length. And that there's no way for new variation to be introduced in the population, right? So no individuals are migrating into the population, bringing variation in the trait. Okay, so without that variation, there can't be any evolution with respect to that particular trait. The trait cannot evolve if there's no variation. Okay. You could also show that even if there's variation, there's no heritability for any of those traits. So for instance, giraffe length varies, but regardless of what the parental giraffe length is, all offspring neck length is completely independent of parent neck length, right? So there's no heritability for neck length. Might be based on how much food they're able to consume, where they live, or something else that is not determined by genetics. Or you could show that even if there is variation, and that variation is heritable, individuals do not gain any upper hand in terms of reproductive success based on that particular trait. The only way that you would expect that trait to increase over time is if individuals with that trait are able to survive and or reproduce more than individuals without that trait. Okay, so even if the trait is heritable and there's variation in the trait, evolution can only occur if individuals with one particular trait or some subset of traits are more likely to leave offspring than individuals with another subset of traits. So hopefully that has helped you better understand some of the material that you've been reading about natural selection, how it leads to evolution, as well as the historical context in which Darwin proposed his revolutionary ideas. We'll see a little bit more about this with real examples in the videos that you'll watch on sickle cell anemia in Africa, as well as rock pocket mice color variation in the United States Southwest.